this video, we will be discussing the ideas, concepts, music, and career of DEVO, a band from Middle America that incubated for years in and around Akron, Ohio, before coming to the attention of some of the top innovators in the industry. In short time, their offbeat, confrontational form of new wave rock cemented their legacy as one of the most iconic bands of the 1980s. And as I've taken a deep dive into their radical ideas, visionary aesthetic, and powerful, often hilarious music, I've had to admit to myself, I can't get it out of my head. On May 4th, 1970, on the campus of Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, where Jerry Casale and Mark Mothersbaugh were attending as students, 28 National Guard soldiers fired 76 rounds for over 13 seconds, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others, one of whom suffered permanent paralysis. This all happened in response to a student protest on campus that was being held in opposition to the U.S. government's unauthorized military incursions into Cambodia during the Vietnam War that year. Jerry knew 2 of the students that were gunned down that day. But because the local paper had reported that it was the National Guardsmen that were killed by the students and not the other way around, trucks filled with armed, deputized townsfolk patrolled the streets during the weeks that followed. Ostensibly, these locals were hired by law enforcement to enforce the curfew, but in Casale's view, their motives were more sinister in nature. He believed they were meant to demonstrate a brutal, authoritarian force to intimidate young people for their beliefs. In other words, a form of government repression. In bearing witness to the killing of his friends and the harsh response of the community and the National Guard afterwards radicalized him and set his life on a different course. It was around this time that he met fellow student, musician, and artist Mark Mothersbaugh. Prior to May 4th, Jerry had been playing bass in a local blues outfit called the Numbers Band, and Mark played keyboards in a group called Flossie Bobbit, which, strangely enough, also featured a young Chrissie Hynde, who would later go on to form the band The Pretenders. While the two shared a keen interest in music and art, the events of May 4th provided each of them with a newfound purpose for making an impact. Their first collaboration wasn't through music, however. Casale, Mothersbaugh, and their friend Bob Lewis formed what they would later describe as a performance art collective. One such performance by this group amounted to a handful of them attending a local exhibition of landscape paintings. They came dressed as art critics, and another one of them came dressed in a gorilla costume. As they perused the paintings in the gallery, they would turn to the gorilla and ask what he thought of a particular piece. If the gorilla responded negatively, apparently through grunting or making obscene gestures, the others would reward him by giving him a sip of milk that they had concealed in a water bottle. They were eventually asked to leave. And now maybe you're thinking to yourself, isn't walking around and making fun of someone else's art kind of a dick move? And I would say, well, sure. But these guys were being dicks in the furtherance of some very particular ideas and concepts. They were challenging what they saw as mediocrity and conformity. Over time, the collective began to coalesce around these 2 big ideas. The first one being something that they called the high and the low, and the other they called de-evolution. Now, the first idea, the high and the low, as they described it, is this idea of combining high-minded concepts like Dadaism or a Marxist critique of class structure with the lowbrow aesthetics of something like a McDonald's television commercial or an evangelical sermon. This second big idea that the band began to coalesce around was this idea of de-evolution, which is DEVO for short. That's where the band got its name from. And it's sort of this inverse of Darwin's theory of evolution, One of the collective's founding members, future lead guitarist Bob Lewis, had brought a book to the group's attention, and it was titled "In the Beginning Was the End: How Men Came into Being Through Cannibalism." And in it, the book's author, Oscar Kiss Merith, claims that humans devolved from a species of brain-eating apes. Now, the book is widely panned as pseudoscience, and its thesis hinges around several debunked concepts of race science. But Mothersbaugh and the others were fascinated by this concept of de-evolution, the idea that maybe humans aren't progressing naturally towards a higher state, that perhaps we've actually already reached the pinnacle of our development and are currently on a slow decline towards something worse. Throughout DEVO's career, they sought to drape their very serious and thoughtful criticisms of society in the imagery and aesthetics of trashy American culture. In addition to these two big ideas, this concept of the high and the low and de-evolution, you have a third thing that's impacting the development of this group of young men, and that is the actual physical place where they came from, which is Akron, Ohio. Most of the members of the group were either from Akron or from the surrounding areas. Kent State University is in a suburb of Akron as well. The first thing you need to know about Akron is that it is an industrial town. It's part of a string of cities throughout the Northeast and Midwest that are commonly referred to as the Rust Belt. And while the greater Akron area had a population of around 500,000 people in the early 70s, it was still very conservative, both politically and culturally. And while Kent would have been probably relatively more liberal due to the fact that there was a university there, it was still a difficult place to find people that were motivated to challenge the status quo. Another way of putting that would be there weren't a lot of weirdos hanging around. So these guys kind of had to stick together. Because there wasn't much of an art or a music scene, they had to inspire and influence themselves. You know, and sometimes a lack of outside influence or reference can lead to mediocrity and not challenging your own ideas. But in the case of this art collective, which later became DEVO, I would say this isolation led to them developing their own unique concepts about the world and their way of doing things within that world. In addition to that, this forged a strong loyalty and cohesion between the group's members because they were viewed as weirdos and outsiders by everyone else around them. So for better or worse, they were trapped in this bubble of their own making, and they had to stick together to get through it. And while we're on the topic of outsiders and weirdos, it's time to hear from our sponsor, Rubbish Shirts. Are you a fan of pop culture? Do you often make references to music and movies that no one else remembers or has even heard of before? Are you or someone you love a sucker for ironic and or humorous clothing? Then you need to visit Rubbish Shirts. You can find their store on both Etsy and eBay. Rubbish Shirts has over 200 designs that reference movies, music, books, slang, or just weird stuff. That's why their motto is Weird Shirts for Cool Jerks. They've got designs featuring your favorite music artists like Steve Winwood, Jeff Lynne, Graham Parsons, Guided by Voices, Weezer, Biggie, Tribe Called Quest, and more. Be the life of your next party or just give them as a gift to your family or significant other. Start a conversation with a complete stranger about Van Halen, or have a chuckle with your bestie about your shared appreciation for Funyuns. Every Rubbish shirt is factory printed on quality Fruit of the Loom HD cotton shirts. The colors don't fade, and the pre-shrunk heavy cotton shirts stand up to many, many wash and dry loads. How do I know so much about Rubbish shirts? Well, as a matter of fact, I make them. Head over to Etsy or eBay and search for Rubbish Shirts, or click the link below in the video's notes. Rubbish Shirts. They're weird shirts for cool jerks. Before the break, we were still referring to this art collective that was started by Mark Mothersbaugh, Gerald Casale, and others But eventually the performance art collective morphed into what we would call an actual band. And the group's first appearance was on April 18th, 1973 at Kent State's Creative Arts Festival. In addition to Mothersbaugh, Casale, and Lewis, the group featured Jerry's brother Bob on guitar, Rob Reisman on drums, and Fred Weber on vocals. And in videos and photos from their set on that day, Mark can be seen standing behind his organ and keyboard wearing a white robe and a giant chimpanzee head with his glasses affixed to the outside so he could still see. And in all the videos that I watched of their performance on that day, they are very young and they're not quite playing the style of music that we attribute to DEVO. They're playing kind of a bluesy garage rock style. So eventually, though, Mark's two brothers, Jim and Bob Mothersbaugh, joined the band on drums and guitar, respectively. Today, we might describe someone like Jim Mothersbaugh to be what is called a circuit bender, or like a person who likes to tweak the electronics of instruments and effects and keyboards to derive like unintended tones and sounds from them that the companies that made these things didn't mean for them to do. So he was this kind of person. He liked to tinker around with stuff. So in addition to constructing his own customized electronic drum kit, Jim also customized the other members of the band's instruments as well. So, for instance, Bob and Mark Mothersbaugh played these really cool customized electric guitars that had effects and envelopes and little filters and knobs affixed to them so that they could make otherworldly sounds with them, sounds that wouldn't normally come from a guitar. So when you were hearing it as a listener, you might think, oh, that's like a keyboard or a synthesizer, but it actually wasn't. It was a customized guitar that Jim was providing to the other members. So even if you were one of the lucky few to have seen DEVO back in those early days in Akron, and you thought the sound was really cool, so you go to your local instrument dealer and you try to purchase equipment to sound like DEVO, you wouldn't have been able to do it because all of this equipment that they're using is all customized. It's all tweaked by Jim Mothersbaugh. And even though we're not there in our timeline, it's kind of cool to note that in 1976, he left the band to pursue a career in electronic engineering, which eventually led him to working for the Roland Corporation in the early 80s. And while he worked for Roland, he was part of the team that developed MIDI technology, which is like a universal digital music language that is still used to this day. By many accounts, their early live performances were confrontational and sometimes outright hostile. Jerry would often book the band at local venues under false pretenses. He would call up the venues and tell the concert promoter that they were a cover band, and when DEVO inevitably showed up and played their own original material, the club owners and the audience members, or both, would basically turn on the band. There's one kind of famous performance that's like this from 1975 that was actually recorded, so you can go onto YouTube and check it out. They did this thing where Jerry called in and they got booked on a local radio station's Halloween event in Cleveland, Ohio. And the band was actually on a bill with legendary jazz artists Sun Ra Orchestra, the Sun Ra Orchestra. If you're into experimental jazz music, you'll definitely have heard of them. So after performing a very short set, the band was accosted and heckled by the audience. And one member even walked up to the stage, grabbed one of the microphones, and called them a bunch of assholes. So after this happens, the band plays one more song, and you can hear the promoter walking up to the stage, and he basically tells them that they have to stop. Some of you, many of you probably look at this as like, oh, what a bummer. That's like, what a terrible show, what a terrible gig. But they sort of saw any negative response that they might get from a crowd or a venue as being like a badge of honor. So that was something that they thought was really funny and really cool. Kind of gives you the the frame of mind that these guys are in. They're in it for the spectacle as much as they are the music itself. From their early days as a band, DEVO would constantly add visual elements and bits to their live performances. An early example of this, and something that the band continued to do for the rest of their career, was that they wore matching outfits. So it could be like black t-shirts with the name emblazoned on them, yellow hazmat suits, gray janitor's uniforms, various sunglasses, masks, hats, knee pads, boots. They had this kind of quirky, faux industrial vibe to the way they looked, and they almost always, wore the exact same thing on stage. And this is kind of a cool thing because from the audience perspective, the band was almost like a single entity, and it sort of gives this impression that the whole of DEVO was greater than the sum of its parts. And this, along with these choreographed motions and movements that the band was doing, the way they would all move in sync with each other, just left a very striking visual presentation for the audience. So, in addition to their matching outfits, the band also started to introduce recurring characters to their stage show. One such example is something that Mark used to do, and he would dress as this character called Boogie Boy, which is actually spelled B-O-O-J-I with no E and no G, which apparently the misspelling of that character's name started with a misspelling that had occurred on a piece of print media. I can't remember if it was a poster or a flyer or some kind of mention in the press where the name was misspelled, and they looked at it and they thought it was really funny. So Boogie Boy is written like Bougie Boy, but it's actually pronounced Boogie Boy. Mark would play this character by putting on a blonde rubber baby's head. And again, he would put his glasses on the outside so he could see. And the character of Boogie Boy is sort of a tragic character. He talks in this high-pitched voice, and he's sort of an innocent victim of this concept of de-evolution. And in almost every single live performance by the band, Boogie Boy makes an appearance. At least all the ones that I watched on YouTube to make this video. Him and other characters become a part of this extended universe of characters and storylines, and it's all a part of this aesthetic in this universe that DEVO creates around their music. And I would say that early on, DEVO's music was pretty groundbreaking and ahead of its time right from the start, because while they're recording this music in 74, 75, 76, a lot of their tracks sound like punk music. And anybody that knows the history of punk music knows that it didn't really come into popularity until around 1977. So they're already doing this early version of punk, or you might call it proto-punk or punk before punk. If you were to play me a track, like Uncontrollable Urge, the early demo of Uncontrollable Urge, I would listen to that and be like, oh, this must be from like the early 80s, right? This is kind of a hardcore band. Kind of sounds like it sounds like punk music, but past the first wave of it. We'll just call it the first wave. Bands like The Clash and the Ramones and the Sex Pistols, their first wave. And then the second wave is like hardcore. So it's like Black Flag, Minor Threat, Bad Brains, those kinds of bands. A lot of their stuff, if I was just to hear it and I didn't know what it was, I would guess that they were from that era. Not from the early 70s, not from the early to mid 70s for sure. So they're kind of ahead of their time, even right out of the gate when they're just kind of f***ing around, which is pretty cool. Another innovative aspect of their early sound comes from their utilization of analog synthesizers, which again, even though there were a lot of bands at that time in the early to mid 70s that were messing around with synthesizers, it's still not a very widely used tool. And Mark Mothersbaugh, who was the keyboard player, even though they all kind of took turns playing keyboards at certain times, he was the main one. He played a mini Moog keyboard Yeah, and also did it in a kind of an unconventional way. Apparently Mark was a big fan of Brian Eno, who was the keyboard synth player for the band Roxy Music, and his sound is very out there. You know, when time comes for Brian Eno's solo on early Roxy Music LP, it sounds like there's like a radio sputtering or like running out of batteries. It doesn't even sound like he's playing notes a lot of the time. And I think that Mark really liked this idea of playing keyboards like that it didn't have to sound like a keyboard, and it didn't have to sound like notes. It could just make noises that were kind of musical, but just otherworldly. So we've talked about this world that DEVO is creating for their music with their characters and the aesthetic of them all dressing the same. We've got these weird sounds that they're putting on their records and using in their live performances. And the other aspect to all of this stuff is the actual songwriting itself and the lyrics in particular. So, and that's something that is another very unique thing about DEVO, because their lyrics and the things that they're describing in their songs are very dark themes. You know, we've got themes of corporate marketing and government repression, mass killings and violence and greed. And the overall effect of this subject matter doesn't come off as very negative, which is something that you might say about some other kinds of punk bands later on, is that they're negative. They're like, oh, the world sucks and this is terrible and I want out and I just want to express my anger and my frustration. But DEVO's songs and the tone and the perspective that they sing them from is always sort of upbeat. And the trick that they use to get there is the characters that they play. And it's because they're these DEVO men. And no matter how oppressive and dystopian the society is, these DEVO men are like automatons, just lovingly accepting whatever pain and suffering that is brought upon them. No matter how unfair the world is, these guys just love it because they're kind of dumb and they're completely complacent. The world, as told through their eyes, is not nearly as dark as it would be from a purely objective point of view. And because of their use of humor and this sarcasm and this tongue-in-cheek tone that they use to portray their music, it takes the edge off these really heavy themes that they're singing about. So a lot of times when artists are recording themselves or recording demos or not in a professional studio, the recording quality has this lo-fi feel. And the band had purchased this TIAC reel-to-reel 4-track, which is a tape machine, and this was the machine that they used to do all of those early recordings. Gerald Casale laments that he thinks that that was the best way that DEVO ever sounded, because when you use lo-fi recording techniques like this, which is basically not using techniques at all, the effect that it has on the overall music is it kind of glues it all together. It softens all the edges and it blends everything so it's not separated. And you might notice that on some more professional sounding recordings that the tracks and the different parts are all very separate from each other. You can hear the guitar, you can hear the bass, and you can hear the drums, and they're all separated and they're all panned into different positions along the left and the right. But when you record in this low budget way, the way the DEVO is doing, it kind of sucks everything all together. Mark Mothersbaugh also had something to say about this, because the first time he had ever heard of this style of recording or thought about it was when he looked on a Todd Rundgren record, and either it was on the back cover or the gatefold inner cover. There was this picture of Todd Rundgren just taken on like a Polaroid camera, and the picture shows that he's in a living room and there's a big recording console in there, and there's all these wires and there's all these microphones set up, and there's a piano in there and all this stuff. And Mark Mothersbaugh was like, oh, that's really cool. Like, he's actually just recording at his house. And when he saw that picture, that was the first time it had ever occurred to him that you could do that. And this period of incubation and relative obscurity starts to take a sharp turn when the band contacts this director, Chuck Statler, and asks him to produce a film for them. Now, the concept for the film was that they would basically make these little short vignettes that would go along to each one of their tracks. It's something that we would today call like a music video. But at the time, this is before MTV, and this was before they ever even had any records to promote, so they're not really music videos. They're really visual representations of their songs. And this is something that DEVO always envisioned, was that there would be a visual component to the music. And so they finally do this, and the film was titled In the Beginning Was the End, The Truth About De-Evolution. So they submitted the film to the Ann Arbor Film Festival in 1976, and the film won first prize. And this got the film included in a collection of other short films that basically toured the country, and it gave the band this exposure that they hadn't had before. It's kind of a new thing, because that's not usually a way that an unsigned band becomes well known, is by a film traveling the country. Usually it would be by touring. And eventually it ended up coming to the attention of Neil Young, of all people. And he liked their film so much that he asked them to portray some characters in his movie, which would eventually be released in the early 80s and was titled Human Highway. And also around this time, one of their tracks was included on a compilation that was released by Stiff Records, which gave them a bunch of distribution in England as well. So now they got three things going for their music as far as exposure. They've got the 7-inch they self-released, this film they put out, and now they're on a compilation. And either due to one or all three of these factors, their music ends up in front of David Bowie's manager, Tony DeFries. And Tony contacted them and said that Bowie might be interested in producing an LP for them. And while this didn't end up panning out, it did lead to them being offered a record contract from Warner Brothers. And in 1978, their very first LP was released. Q, Are We Not Men? A, We Are DEVO. And while it wasn't produced by Bowie, the production duties did go to one Brian Eno, Mark Mothersbaugh's keyboard and synth hero. The promotion for the first album landed the band an appearance on Saturday Night Live on October 14th, 1978. And finally, America tuned in to witness a group of 5 strange-looking men on screen dressed in yellow hazmat suits and rectangular sunglasses. And undoubtedly to many, they must have just kind of seemed like a weird avant-garde sideshow. And so here were these 5 guys, these kind of nerdy punks with this weird look. To so many people, that must have been just the first time they'd ever seen a band look like that and sound like that. And it's that cult following that continued on for the rest of their career. And that's really important because this is the beginning of them making this connection with an audience that is completely autonomous to the music industry at large. But I think because DEVO made such an impact on their fans, they were able to do things artistically moving forward that a lot of bands might not be willing to try because of how it might affect their career. The band's follow-up LP, Duty Now for the Future, was released the following year in 1979. This time, the production duties fell to Ken Scott, someone who had previously worked with Bowie in the early 70s. Scott said of the band later, quote, "DEVO always wanted to learn. That's why they worked with each producer only once. They took what they needed and then it was time to move on," end quote. And to my ears, this album has a lot of similar qualities to the first LP. They're still using their synthesizers and the core of the band is still closer to what you might call a traditional rock and roll sound. So it's got real drums, real bass and electric guitar, etc. And I think overall this record is really solid. The next LP, 1980's Freedom of Choice, was decidedly more electronic in overall style. So there's more synthesizers, there's drum machines, and the band is moving from what you might describe as like a punk sound into what would be described as like a new wave sound. That album features Girl You Want and my personal all-time favorite DEVO song, Gates of Steel, which is probably the band's most anthemic and also optimistic song. And it's a great song to sing along to with all your friends, for sure. But I can't move on from talking about this LP until we talk about its biggest hit, which was Whip It. Whip It charted on the Billboard Top 40 and is still the band's most recognizable tune to this day. And in fact, not only was it just a really big song or a really big hit for the band, this song, along with its very enigmatic video, which was played on MTV incessantly at the time and featured the band in their all black and very famous, now famous, red Energy Dome hats. And in the video, Mark Mothersbaugh is whipping a woman's clothes off, and it's just a very iconic video. But this song was not just a hit. It kind of became part of the zeitgeist. There's rarely a retrospective or a look back on the decade of the 1980s that doesn't mention this song or mention DEVO. So now they're just solidified in history as an iconic band from this period. So here we have this band DEVO, who from their inception has been so critical of the society at large and especially of the music industry. And it's somehow just classic DEVO that in the midst of them lambasting the culture through this song Whip It, they somehow wind up right in the middle of it. And they become just really famous. In a sense, they become the very thing that they're parodying. And I'm sure that the irony of that was not lost on the band members. 1981 saw the release of two LPs, DEVO Live and their fourth studio album, New Traditionalists. The cover of the LP featured the band wearing matching baby blue utopian Boy Scout uniforms, complete with black plastic pompadours that were apparently modeled after JFK's haircut. The LP opens with the song Through Being Cool, which sounds like a response to the band's sudden fame after the success of Whip It. I really enjoy the vibe of this record overall. It has very driving rhythms, which are still by and large performed by real instruments as opposed to a drum machine and synthesizers. And the synthesizer tones that they do use are very soft and warm and almost gooey, and they sort of lay over the top of this really driving rhythm section. To my ears, it's a great marriage of the classic DEVO sound and their newer electronic new wave sound. The title of the album, New Traditionalists, was apparently derived from a phrase they came across while on tour in Japan. The New Traditionalists, or New Traditionalism, was a right-wing political movement. Because DEVO thought of themselves as being this kind of new traditionalism, they thought it would be funny to borrow this phrase. A couple noteworthy tracks are Love Without Anger and Beautiful World. And I will say that overall, this album really encapsulates this dystopian view of the world that DEVO has cultivated through their early career. There's something more dark about this album in its feel and its subject matter. But overall, I would say that this might be my favorite LP to just put on and listen to from cover to cover. According to Jerry Casale, some recent reviews of DEVO had described the band as fascist and clowns. Now, these criticisms may have come from the same person. I'm not sure. I didn't read these actual reviews that he's referring to. But 1982's LP, Oh No, It's DEVO, was apparently their attempt to make music that fascist clowns would make. I don't think that this is music for fascist clowns or fascist clown core or whatever you want to call it, but you can decide for yourself. But I will say, though, that this is the first album where they've moved completely, fully electronic, and they're what I would describe as like a synth pop band or like a full-on new wave band. And song-wise, I don't think it's nearly as strong as their previous LP. The real innovation during this time period came from their 1982 tour, because this was the very first tour where the visuals were projected on stage and synced with the music. Even though this is a pretty common practice nowadays, apparently at the time it was logistically very difficult to pull off. Since this was before the era of digital video, a time code was stamped on the analog tape from which the visuals were being projected. This tape could be then synced with a click track or a clock that the band was playing along to. Due to the experimental nature of this process, things didn't always go according to plan, and in a video that I saw on YouTube from this tour, the band is seen falling out of step with the visuals. So they actually stop the show, apologize to the audience, and say, "Hey, we got to fix this and we'll start again once we get it all worked out." And the incident that I witnessed in this video just shows you where the band's mentality was at the time. That these visuals that they were projecting and syncing along with the music was an integral part of their live show at that time. If the visuals were out of sync, in their eyes, they considered the show not to be the show that they wanted to do. When the technology did work, and I assume that that was the case for most of the time, the audience must have been completely wowed by this. Because finally, DEVO was able to fully immerse their crowd in this world of their own creation. Nuclear bombs could detonate to the sound of a snare hit, or Boogie Boy could escape the physical boundaries of the stage and wander around in the wide world. Their goal of utilizing a completely multimedia approach to performing was finally coming to fruition. It was on the band's sixth studio LP, Shout, that it could be said that perhaps one of DEVO's greatest strengths up until this point, its embracing of new technology, actually became a weakness. And the reason for that is that by 1984, Mothersbaugh had become very enthralled with the use of new keyboards and music technologies. As a result of this, he came to acquire a Fairlight CMI, which is an early digital sampler sequencer, which even came complete with an old-school green and black computer monitor. For those not familiar with sequencer technology, a sequencer is a piece of equipment where the user can program in a part, say a bass part or a drum part, and the sequencer will play that part back along with any other parts that you have also programmed into the sequencer. The performance of the music is actually done by the computer and not by a human being. During the recording session for Shout, they were experimenting with this Fairlight CMI, and some of the band members were not pleased with the results. Casale and the others pushed to keep the core of the rhythm tracks, the drums, the bass, the guitars, as actual instruments performed by the band members themselves. Mothersbaugh disagreed and ultimately ended up having the final say. A vast majority of the album's tracks would be performed by the Fairlight sequencer. And I will say that in my opinion, it gives this album a very stiff, clinical feel. Because you don't have human beings performing the basic rhythm tracks, the overall effect is music that sounds too quantized and maybe too perfect or not fluid. Casale is quoted in Billboard magazine in 2007. The Fairlight just kind of took over everything on that record. I mean, I loved the songwriting and the ideas, but the Fairlight kind of really determined the sound. After hearing this story, I couldn't help but thinking of the famous quote from Malcolm in Jurassic Park. They were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. At least Mark Mothersbaugh didn't. DEVO's last two studio albums before they took their long hiatus were 1988's Total DEVO and 1990's Smooth Noodle Maps. And if nothing else, they did put the feel back into their music. Still, there's a marked change in the overall approach of these records. The first thing that jumped out at me was the songwriting. On these records, the songwriting has become more insular. Gone are the days of DEVO's relentless mocking of the broader culture, the inside jokes, the absurd tragic characters, the dogged adherence to the band's concept and ideology, etc., etc. These albums are decidedly more individualistic and personally reflective. Songs about love, regrets, emotional development, and sex draw the energy of the songs inward as opposed to outward towards the society at large. And while they don't have the rigid computerized feel of the Shout LP, the songs do seem to be drowned in a sea of gadgets and new tech. And maybe it was the intention of Casale or Mothersbaugh to go completely over the top with all these digital and analog synthesizer sounds to, in a sense, bring this new technology to its ultimate ridiculous conclusion. And sure, maybe that was their intention, and maybe that sounds good on paper, but to my ears, the music really suffers for it. It's almost as if the arrangements for these songs are completely obscured by this cold, digitized texture. And a lot of albums from this time period have the same quality to them. It's a very tinny, harsh, unnatural sound. And perhaps that's a result of the fact that throughout the 80s, as they were developing all this technology and doing all this cocaine, they just couldn't hear how abrasive this sound was. They kept trying to make it more and more bombastic, but in the end, it just ends up making it sound kind of tinny and difficult to listen to for an extended period of time, in my opinion. Or maybe the band, to quote the opening track on Smooth Noodle Maps, was stuck in a loop. I personally wouldn't have minded if the band was stuck in a loop set a decade earlier, but on these two records, it does sound as if the band has lost their original thread. Apparently, even DEVO itself must devolve and become something else. The beginning truly was the end all along. And during that hiatus, or after the band's first breakup, Mothersbaugh, who had begun pursuing a career in making soundtracks for television, movies, and video games, shifted his focus towards this work. And I don't really blame him, because getting paid good money to sit at home and compose music and not have to deal with all of the drama and the slings and arrows of going on tour, sounds pretty good to me. And from kind of humble beginnings, Mark Mothersbaugh built this really impressive career, and he's done some super big movies. I think you'd be surprised at some of the titles that he has done the soundtrack for, because it definitely doesn't sound like DEVO. And Jared Casale in this period, he kind of continues to embody what I call this rebellious spirit of DEVO. He does a ton of interviews. He's on a bunch of other documentaries about other bands, and he's very outspoken about his opinions. And the feeling that I get from Casale during this period all the way up until the present day is that he seems to have taken on this role that, like, for instance, Stuart Copeland did in The Police, or Liam Gallagher does in Oasis. And by that, I mean, he just seems like he's always ready for this band to get back together. He wants DEVO to reform and pick up right where they left off. He always believed in what DEVO represented, and he always thought that they had more work to do. And lucky for Casale, the band does get back together, and they get back together multiple times. Since then, they've gone on all these great tours. I never got to see them, or I haven't seen them yet. I don't know if I'll have a chance to now, but everyone that I've talked to that's gone to see them in recent years just says how amazing they are. To some degrees, they're maybe even better live than they ever were. They really utilize all this new technology, and they still project, video behind the band, and there's bits, and there's humor. There's the classic DEVO humor. And even though they're older guys, you would say, hey, they still got it. They've really returned to their original credo. In addition to all these really cool tours that they've done, in 2010, they actually released a studio album called Something for Everybody, which I think is really great. And it's a real return to the classic early 80s DEVO sound that made them really famous and made them a household name. So it's very nostalgic, but I would say that it's also a great balance of being nostalgic, but also being relevant. The new tracks are very fresh. And in fact, that is the title of track 1 on this album. It's called Fresh. Not every band that reunites in their later years is able to do something this great. And I think Something for Everybody is just a fantastic LP. So in closing, I'll just share this little kind of observation that I've always made about DEVO. Because whenever people ask me about this band, I always say DEVO was the last band. And I know that's literally not true, because Obviously, there's been more bands since DEVO, and actually DEVO is still currently actively a band. So, but what I kind of mean by that is just their whole idea. They kind of brought to an end this kind of touchy-feely 60s, hey, we're going to have music and art and culture change the whole world and it'll be a better place. I think DEVO was like, no, that is not true. That's never going to happen. And also this whole apparatus that you've constructed to allow that to happen, that's also false. The music industry, this marketing, these big conglomerates that own all this production, all that's false. And they just look at that situation. Instead of bitching and moaning about it, they just point to it and they laugh, and they help us laugh too. And it kind of just makes this whole concept of being in a band in the modern era just seem kind of absurd. And the fact that we have these idols and the fact that we worship these people, I think is very silly. You know, so was DEVO the last band? Probably not, but I kind of like to think that they had the last laugh. And that's just what I've always appreciated about DEVO. And it is my hope through this video and through re-examining or re-exploring their music that you'll feel a similar way about them as well. And the next time you're exploring your local nuclear waste storage facility and a giant man baby runs up, hands you a ceramic unicorn lamp, and utters in a high-pitched voice, "It's a beautiful world," you'll probably think to yourself, I can't get it out of my head. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. Be sure to check out our sponsor, Rubbish Shirts, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks.